Imagine a cold so absolute that it doesn't just chill the skin, it turns the very air into a weapon. In the winter of 1915, on the jagged peaks of the Carpathians, soldiers didn't just die from bullets. They were found in the morning standing upright in their trenches, frozen solid into macabre statues of ice. This was the Eastern Front theater of war, so vast and so brutal that it makes the nightmare of Verdun look like a prelude. While the world remembers the muddy trenches of the West, here in the White Grave, three empires, the Russian, the German, and the Austro-Hungarian, clashed in a struggle that defied human endurance. We are talking about a conflict where chemical weapons were neutralized by the sheer freezing breath of the wind, where starving men in the besieged fortress of Przemysl devoured 10,000 horses until they were found with their faces smeared in raw blood, and where the casualty list reached a staggering 2 million souls in just 4 months. This isn't just a history of maps and generals. This is the story of the cruel Folly, a descent into a frozen abyss where the average soldier lasted only 5 weeks before being claimed by lead or frost. Today, we go beyond the statistics to uncover the psychological horror and the tactical madness of the winter battles of 1915. This is history at its most haunting. History books often describe war as a clash of wills, a chess match between generals played out in mud and steel. But in the early months of 1915 on the Eastern Front, the primary antagonist wasn't a man. It wasn't a doctrine. It was the air itself. By January, the front line had stretched into a jagged, bleeding scar that ran from the Baltic shores of East Prussia, down through the heart of Russian Poland, and deep into the treacherous peaks of the Carpathians. To the men stationed there, the Eastern Line was no longer a tactical position. It had become a vast, lethal expanse where the environment was an active predator. At minus 25 degrees Celsius, the world changes. This isn't just cold. This is a temperature that alters the chemistry of survival. At minus 25, the moisture in your breath turns to needles of frost on your scarf. The oil in your rifle thickens into a stubborn sludge, turning a modern weapon into a useless club of wood and iron. But the most terrifying aspect of this temperature isn't what it does to the machines, is what it does to the human soul. Imagine a night in the Carpathian passes. There is no warmth, there is no shelter. The Austro-Hungarian troops, pushed forward by a command that refused to acknowledge the reality of the season, found themselves in a landscape that rejected human life. Colonel Georg Wieth, a man who witnessed the limits of human endurance, recorded a horror that feels more like a ghost story than a military report. He spoke of the 21st Rifle Regiment, men who were ordered to hold the frontline trenches during a night of monstrous masses of snow. When the relief parties arrived in the morning, they didn't find a unit ready for inspection. They found a gallery of statues. Every single man in the trench had frozen to death in his position, eyes open, rifles gripped in stiffened fingers staring out into the white void. Hundreds froze to death every day, Wieth recalled. This was the human tune of the 1915 winter, a symphony of silence. There was no grand music here, only the sound of knees buckling under 40 pounds of wet canvas and the soft thud of a body hitting the snow. For a premium audience, we must look past the tragedy to the tactical insanity. The Central Powers, led by Austrian Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hitzendorf, were desperate to relieve the besieged fortress of Przemysl. But their relief plan relied on a level of wishful thinking that bordered on the criminal. In these mountains, the very concept of supply became a dark joke. No wagon could advance. No beast of burden could find its footing in the drifts. This meant that every scrap of bread, every bullet, and every gallon of fuel had to be carried up the slopes by the soldiers themselves. Think of the psychological weight. You are starving. You have been without food for days. You are tasked with carrying a crate of ammunition up a mountain pass in a blizzard. You see your comrade, a porter just like you, collapse 10 feet ahead. In the minus 25 degrees Celsius bite of the Carpathians, you don't stop to help him. To stop is to die. You watch as the snow begins to claim him before he even draws his last breath. Every wounded man who couldn't drag himself along was simply left. It is a brutal war Atelier reality. The wounded didn't cry for doctors. They cried because they knew the silence was coming. Entire skirmishing lines would surrender in tears, not because they had lost their loyalty to the emperor, but because the agony of the cold had finally eclipsed the fear of the enemy. This wasn't a localized disaster. This was happening across a front that dwarfed the battlefields of the West. While the British and French were beginning to understand the nightmare of trenchfoot in the damp of Flanders, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies were losing thousands to exposure before a single shot was fired. The Russian Southwest Front, under General Ivanov, held the advantage of better rail connections and superior artillery, but even they were not immune to the White Grave. The Russians, too, were fighting a war of attrition against the elements. General Alexei Brusilov, a man of iron resolve, looked at his new conscripts poorly trained and weakened by the losses of 1914, and wondered how many would survive the night, let alone a bayonet charge. As the sun set on the first weeks of 1915, the stage was set for a cruel folly. Three empires, the German, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian, were about to pour millions of lives into this frozen abyss. They were chasing strategic hubs and prestige, but the land had other plans. In the chapters to follow, we will see the fortress of Przemysl turn into a charnel house. We will see the German pincer close in a blizzard at the Masurian lakes. But it all begins here, in the White Grave, where the air kills, the snow buries, and the only certainty is the cold. By the opening weeks of 1915, the maps spread across the desks of the Austro-Hungarian High Command in Vienna were more than just paper. They were a record of a dying organism. The Eastern Front did not resemble a stable border. It was a jagged, bleeding incision that ran deep through East Prussia and the vast territories of Galicia, which were now largely held by Russian forces. While the Central Powers still occupied portions of Russian Poland, the psychological and strategic weight of the war was shifting violently toward the south. The greatest existential threat facing the Central Powers was not a breakthrough in the West, but the looming collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire under the weight of the Russian steamroller. To the Russian commanders, the Carpathian Mountains were no longer a barrier, they were a gateway. Russian troops were perched in the high mountain passes, threatening to break out into the vulnerable Hungarian plain. If they succeeded, they would deal a crushing blow to the Habsburg army from which the empire might never recover. At the center of this geopolitical nightmare sat the fortress of Przemysl. Since September 1914, this massive Austro-Hungarian bastion had been surrounded by Russian forces, a lonely island of stone and steel deep behind enemy lines. Inside the fortress walls, 130,000 soldiers and 30,000 civilians were trapped in a slowly tightening noose. Food was beginning to vanish, and the meat of slaughtered horses was becoming a luxury. To Vienna, the relief of Przemysl was not just a military necessity. It was a matter of imperial prestige that they were desperate to resolve at any price. But the army tasked with this rescue was a ghost of its former self. In the brutal opening campaigns of 1914, the Habsburg army had suffered crippling, irreparable losses. Most devastating was the destruction of the professional officer corps, the very backbone of the imperial military machine. The men who remained were often poorly trained conscripts, led by surviving officers who were exhausted and demoralized. Historians would later describe this force as little more than a militia whose commanders had begun to look upon their own, Slavic troops with a toxic blend of suspicion and disgust, fearing mass disloyalty. This was the human tune of the Austro-Hungarian collapse, an army that did not trust itself, led by a command that did not trust its men. At the top of this fractured hierarchy was Franz Conrad von Hitzendorf, the Austrian chief of the general staff. Conrad was a man of high ambition and even higher wishful thinking. He was in a frantic hurry to strike, knowing that Przemysl, located over 100 kilometers behind the Russian front, could not hold out forever. Conrad's strategy for early 1915 was a masterpiece of denial. He planned a massive winter offensive through the treacherous Carpathian passes. Despite the fact that his army was weakened, his railways were inadequate for supply, and his artillery was severely lacking. His plan was almost identical to the one that had failed miserably in December 1914. Yet he insisted on repeating the folly. He relied heavily on the hope of German intervention, a hope that was met with cold reluctance by the German overall commander, Erich Falkenhayn. Falkenhayn had no interest in the frozen wastes of the east. His eyes were fixed on the Western Front. However, the German High Command was also divided. Influential generals like Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff argued that a decisive blow in the east could restore Vienna as prestige and perhaps, more importantly, prevent neutral nations like Italy, Romania, or Bulgaria from joining the war against the Central Powers. Fearing a total Habsburg collapse that would leave Germany fighting alone, Falkenhayn finally, reluctantly, agreed to a coordinated offensive. The stage was set for a tragedy of errors. The Austro-Hungarians, Germans, and Russians all prepared their own offensives for early 1915, but it was the Habsburg army that would strike first, driven by Conrad's desperation. The main relief effort would be led by the Third Austro-Hungarian Army and a newly formed German-Austrian Southern Army. Their objective was to seize the mountain passes and a vital rail hub before marching on the starving garrison at Przemysl. The reality on the ground, however, was a far cry from the tactical lines drawn in Vienna. The Austro-Hungarians barely outnumbered the Russians they were meant to displace. Furthermore, General Ivanov's Russian Southwest Front held the tactical advantage of better artillery and more reliable rail connections for supply. When the Austro-Hungarians finally struck on January 23rd, they didn't just find a Russian enemy. They found a landscape that was fundamentally hostile to human life. The vanishing empire was now sending its sons into a white hell. In the deep snow and sub-zero ice of the Carpathians, the suffering reached levels that the human mind can barely process. Soldiers were forced to dig shallow holes in the snow for shelter, only to be found the next morning frozen into the very ground they had tried to use for protection. In some sectors, entire skirmishing lines surrendered in tears, not out of cowardice, but as a desperate attempt to escape the physical agony of the cold. As the offensive began to stall within days, the psychological breakdown of the army accelerated. Officers like Siegmund Naas bore witness to a unique horror, the lethal nature of sleep. Men who had been fighting for weeks without respite knew that to close their eyes at night was to invite an immediate death by freezing. They stood exposed and immobile in front of enemy positions, watching their comrades collapse from exhaustion and frostbite while their own artillery remained trapped miles behind the front, unable to move through the monstrous snowdrifts. This was the rot at the heart of the Habsburg effort. The soldiers were dying of exposure, the horses were being eaten in the fortress, and the generals were arguing over maps that bore no resemblance to the frozen trenches. The collapse of morale was not a surprise. It was the inevitable conclusion of a command structure that treated human lives as disposable counters in a game of prestige. While Conrad continued to order futile attacks, the Russian counteroffensive was already being prepared. General Ivanov saw the exhaustion of the Habsburg Third Army and knew that now was the time to strike back. The Russians were not just holding the line. They were preparing to turn the Carpathians into a graveyard for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By early March, the Second Habsburg Offensive had failed miserably. The mountain passes remained under Russian control, and the unexpected ray of sunshine that Tsar Nicholas II would later write about the fall of Przemysl was fast approaching. The empire was vanishing, not in a single dramatic explosion, but in the slow, rhythmic freezing of its soldiers and the starvation of its besieged cities. The cruel folly of the Carpathian campaign was now fully revealed. The Germans, observing the disaster from the north, trusted their Austro-Hungarian allies even less than before. They saw an army in tatters, a command in denial, and a front that was held together by nothing more than the thin, frozen breath of men who had no more hope left to give. The winter of 1915 was more than just a season of war. It was the moment the Austro-Hungarian Empire realized it was already dead. It was a ghost empire haunting its own battlefields, waiting for the spring thaw to reveal the true scale of the carnage it had wrought in the name of a rescue that would never come. While the soldiers in the Carpathian passes were being carved into statues of ice, the war was being directed from rooms that smelled of expensive tobacco, aged parchment, and the cold, sterile scent of high-level bureaucracy. This was the world of the divided giants, the high commands of the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires. For a premium audience, Understanding the tragedy of 1915 requires looking past the tactical movements and into the psychological schisms that paralyzed the leadership on both sides. In the grand palaces and headquarters where the maps were spread, the war was not a struggle for survival. It was a clash of massive, fragile egos. At Stavka, the supreme headquarters of the Russian Imperial Army, the atmosphere was one of strained grandeur and mounting dread. The Russian giant was physically immense but strategically fractured. By early 1915, the Eastern Front was a sprawling entity, and the men responsible for moving its parts were locked in a bitter internal Cold War. The primary fault line ran between two men, General Nikolai Rushki and General Nikolai Ivanov. Rushki, commanding the Northwest Front, was a man whose eyes were fixed firmly on the North. He believed the true heart of the enemy was Germany, and he advocated for a massive, crushing strike against East Prussia or Silesia. To Rushki, the Austro-Hungarians were a sideshow, a decaying force that would collapse naturally if the German spine was broken. In contrast, General Ivanov, leading the Southwest Front, was obsessed with the South. He saw the Austro-Hungarian Empire not as a sideshow but as the soft underbelly of the Central Powers. He demanded that Russian resources be poured into the Carpathians, arguing that a breakthrough into the Hungarian plain would force the Habsburgs out of the war and leave Germany isolated. This wasn't just a tactical disagreement. It was a fundamental divide in Russian military philosophy. While these two titans argued, a third voice, General Alexei Brusilov, offered a more haunting perspective. Brusilov was not worried about where to attack. He was worried about who was doing the attacking. He looked at the lists of reinforcements arriving at the front and saw a looming disaster. The heavy losses of 1914 had wiped out the professional core of the Russian army. The new conscripts were raw, poorly trained, and psychologically unprepared for the white grave of the Carpathians. Brusilov feared that the army was being hollowed out from within, becoming a massive body with no muscles. Overseeing this fractured command was the Grand Duke Nikolai. As the supreme commander, it was his duty to choose a single, decisive path. However, in a move that historians would later cite as a primary cause of the year's bloodletting, the Grand Duke attempted to solve the dispute by avoiding a choice altogether. He allowed preparations for attacks by both the Northwest Front and the Southwest Front to proceed simultaneously. In the war atelier reality of war, this was a death sentence for thousands. By refusing to prioritize one front, the Grand Duke ensured that neither would have the overwhelming concentration of shells, supplies, or men needed to achieve a breakthrough. The Russian giant was trying to punch in two directions at once, and in doing so, it was overextending its reach until its bones began to crack. The paralysis was not unique to the Russians. Across the lines, the Central Powers were embroiled in a mirror's image struggle of ego and distrust. The biggest problem facing Berlin and Vienna was the existential threat the Russian army posed to Austria-Hungary. The fortress of Przemysl was under siege, and the Russian presence in the Carpathians threatened to deal a crushing blow to the Habsburg army. Austrian chief of the General Staff Franz Conrad von Hitzendorf was a man possessed by a single, desperate goal. He insisted on relieving Przemysl at any price. To Conrad, the fortress was more than a military asset. It was a symbol of the empire's right to exist. He demanded German troops and German shells to fuel his mountain obsession. However, the German overall commander, Erich Falkenhayn, viewed Conrad's plans with a mixture of contempt and alarm. Falkenhayn was a Westerner. He believed the war would be won or lost in the trenches of France and Belgium, and he resented every battalion sent to bail out the crippled Austro-Hungarian army. But Falkenhayn, much like the Grand Duke, was not the only voice in the room. He was under immense pressure from the Easterners, the legendary duo of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. Fresh off their triumphs at Tannenberg, Hindenburg and Ludendorff argued that a massive offensive in the east could restore Vienna's prestige and crucially keep neutral powers like Italy, Romania, and Bulgaria from joining the war against them. The atmosphere between the German and Austrian commands was thick with human-tuned resentment. Falkenhayn feared a total Habsburg collapse. He knew that if Austria-Hungary fell, Germany would be left alone against the world. Reluctantly, he struck a bargain with Conrad. He agreed to a German-led offensive in East Prussia. What the divided giants failed to account for was the physical reality of the Eastern Front. While they argued in heated rooms over rail hubs and prestige, they were ignoring the logistical nightmare of the winter. Conrad's plan, in particular, was built on wishful thinking. He was sending his men into a terrain where railways were inadequate, artillery was short, and the weather was an executioner. For the premium viewer, the horror of Chapter 3 is found in this disconnect. The generals were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were men of high status who had become disconnected from the human tune of their own soldiers. They saw 100,000 casualties as a statistical necessity for prestige. They viewed the desertion of a regiment not as a sign of human exhaustion, but as a political betrayal. As the orders were signed and the telegraphs hummed with the news of the upcoming offensives, the divided giants had essentially created a meat grinder that spanned 1,000 miles. They had prepared the stage for a titanic struggle in East Prussia, the Carpathians, Bukovina, and at the gates of Przemysl. The Russian army, weakened by 1914 and filled with raw recruits, was about to be thrust into a two-front assault. The Austro-Hungarian army, its officer corps already decimated, was being asked to perform a miracle in the deep snow. And the Germans, the most efficient of the giants, were preparing a chemical and tactical nightmare that would soon descend upon the Russian lines. The giants had spoken. Now it was time for the men in the snow to pay the bill. The tragedy of the 1915 winter was not that the empires were too strong, but that they were too divided to be anything other than destructive. The bloodletting that followed figures that would eventually surpass those of the Somme or Verdun was the direct result of this failure of leadership at the very top. To understand the Eastern Front of 1915, one must look at Przemysl not as a military fortification, but as a vast, slowly cooling tomb. In the pre-war years, Przemysl had been the crown jewel of the Austro-Hungarian defense system in Galicia, a sprawling ring of concrete, steel, and subterranean galleries. But by January 1915, it had become an island of shadows, a place where the distinction between the living and the dead was becoming increasingly blurred. Inside the perimeter of this massive fortress, 130,000 soldiers and 30,000 civilians were trapped. They were surrounded by the Russian 11th Army, a force that understood they didn't need to breach the walls with shells. They only needed to wait for the winter to finish the job. For a premium audience, the horror of Przemysl isn't found in the sound of the guns, but in the silence of the kitchens. At the beginning of the siege, the garrison's officers spoke of honor, duty, and the impregnable nature of their position. But honor is a luxury of the well-fed. As the weeks bled into months, the arithmetic of survival took over. The supply lines had been severed in September 1914, and by January, the stockpiles were gone. The human tune of Przemysl was the sound of the knife. To sustain the 130,000 men, the garrison commander, Hermann Kuzmanek von Bergnestedt, made the agonizing decision to begin slaughtering the army's most vital asset, its horses. It began with the weak and the wounded, but eventually even the fine mounts of the cavalry were led to the butcher's block. By the end of the siege, over 10,000 horses had been consumed. One of the most haunting aspects of the siege was the stark social divide that persisted even as the world ended. Inside the shadow city, the Austro-Hungarian class system remained rigidly, cruelly intact. While the common soldiers huddled in damp, unheated casemates, dying of scurvy and typhus, the high-ranking officers attempted to maintain the facade of imperial elegance. Reports from the time suggest that, in the officers' messes, fine wines were still served, and the table linens were kept white, even as the human porters outside were collapsing from exhaustion. This wasn't just inequality, it was a psychological poison. The soldiers knew they were being asked to die for a command structure that did and share their misery. This resentment would later fuel the mass desertions and the eventual collapse of the Habsburg military spirit. What does it do to the mind to be trapped in a white grave for months on end? The psychological state of the Przemysl garrison was one of profound, rhythmic despair. Every day, the men looked toward the Carpathian peaks to the south, listening for the sound of Conrad's relief guns. Every day, the wind brought nothing but more snow and the distant, mocking bark of Russian artillery. The environment within the fortress became uncanny. Because of the lack of fuel, the massive stone structures were perpetually damp and freezing. Men lived in a world of gray shadows and flickering oil lamps. The lack of vitamin C led to the black death of scurvy teeth falling out, old wounds reopening, and legs turning black with internal bleeding. In the creepy fuel aesthetic, these men weren't soldiers anymore. They were the walking wounded, phantoms guarding a graveyard. The Russian besiegers, led by General Selivanov, played a psychological game. They didn't launch massive infantry waves that would waste Russian lives. Instead, they kept a constant, low-level pressure. They fired just enough shells to keep the garrison from sleeping, and they sent scouts to leave reminders near the Austro-Hungarian lines newspapers detailing the failures of the relief offensives. They wanted the men inside to know that no one was coming. To the soldiers inside, the outer world had become a myth. They heard rumors of the winter battle in the Carpathians, where their comrades were supposedly fighting through minus 25 degrees Celsius blizzards to reach them. But as January turned to February and February to March, the reality set in. The rescue was a cruel folly. Each time an Austro-Hungarian relief offensive was launched in the mountains, the garrison was ordered to prepare for a breakout. They would gather what little strength they had left, sharpen their bayonets, and wait for the signal. And each time the signal never came. The relief armies were being chewed up by the white hell of the mountain passes, failing to get within 50 miles of the fortress. The tragedy reached its peak when the garrison realized that even if the relief army reached them, there was no way to get the 130,000 men out. They were too weak to march, the horses were gone, and the Russian 11th Army was dug in with heavy siege guns. The fortress had become a black hole, sucking in the resources and lives of the empire without giving anything back. By mid-March 1915, the human tune of Przemysl had reached its final, discordant note. The last of the horses were gone. The cats and dogs of the city had disappeared. The soldiers were eating bread made of sawdust and straw. The hospital wards were overflowing with men who weren't wounded by bullets, but by the sheer absence of nutrition. Commander Kuzminich finally realized that the end was inevitable. But even in surrender, there was a final act of horror. He ordered the destruction of the fortress. He didn't want the Russians to inherit the prestige of the works. On the morning of March 22nd, the ground shook as the great magazines were blown up. The massive steel turrets, the pride of Vienna, were twisted into scrap metal. The smoke from the explosions mixed with the falling snow, creating a black and white landscape of total ruin. When the Russian troops finally walked through the gates, they didn't find a defiant army. They found a collection of shadows men so thin they looked like skeletons wrapped in gray wool. For the premium audience, Przemysl serves as a chilling case study in the logistics of despair. The fall of the fortress resulted in the capture of 9 generals, 2,500 officers, and 117,000 soldiers. It was the greatest single surrender of the war for the Central Powers at that point. But the real creepy fuel legacy is the psychological impact. The fall of Przemysl sent a shockwave through the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It proved their impregnable defenses were a lie, and that their leadership was willing to let 130,000 men rot in a cage for the sake of a map line. As the prisoners were marched off to the depths of Russia, many of them destined to die in Siberian camps, the Siege of Shadows came to a close. But the white grave was far from full. The focus now shifted north to the Masurian lakes, where the Germans were preparing a tactical nightmare that would rival the starvation of Przemysl in its sheer, cold-blooded efficiency. On the morning of January 23, 1915, the silence of the Carpathian Mountains was shattered. But it wasn't the sound of a grand symphony of artillery that announced the offensive. It was the rhythmic, desperate gasping of thousands of men trying to breathe in air that felt like liquid ice. This was the start of the Austro-Hungarian relief effort per Przemysl, a campaign that would come to be known as the Winter Battle in the Carpathians. To the generals in Vienna, it was a tactical necessity. To the men on the slopes, it was a descent into a vertical purgatory. For a premium audience, it is essential to understand the technical how of mountain warfare in 1915. This was not the mechanized war of the future. There were no helicopters to leapfrog over peaks, no heated transport to carry supplies. In the Besieged Mountains, the war was reduced to its most primitive and punishing elements. The primary objective was the Ushak Pass. In the geometry of war, a mountain pass is a funnel. Whoever holds the high ground at the exit of the funnel holds the power of life and death over anyone trying to move through it. The Russian forces, specifically the 8th Army under General Brusilov, had spent weeks digging into these heights. They hadn't just built trenches. They had turned the mountainside into a tiered fortress of ice and stone. The Austro-Hungarian Third Army, commanded by Svetozar Borovec, was ordered to charge upward. In tactical terms, this is almost suicidal. To attack uphill in waist-deep snow means your movement is slowed to a crawl. You are a silhouette against the white, a perfect target for Russian snipers and machine gunners who are sitting comfortably in eagle's nest positions. The most war Atelier aspect of this ascent was the silence of the guns. Modern war relies on artillery, but in the Carpathians of 1915, the big guns were often useless. Think of the weight of a standard field gun. Now, imagine trying to move that several-ton piece of steel up a 30-degree incline through 4 feet of fresh powder. The horses, those that hadn't been eaten in Przemysl, lost their footing on the icy ledges and tumbled into the ravines, taking their handlers with them. This meant that the Austro-Hungarians often attacked without the shield of artillery. They were sent into the Russian wire with nothing but their bayonets and their dwindling will. The human tune of the logistics was the formation of the human chains. Thousands of men were diverted from the fighting just to carry shells, bread, and timber up the mountains. They moved in a trance-like state, a literal line of ghosts winding up the white slopes. If a man slipped, the chain didn't stop. It simply closed the gap. The mountainside became littered with abandoned crates and frozen botas, markers of a supply line that was failing in real time. When combat did occur, it was hauntingly intimate. Because of the terrain, large-scale maneuvers were impossible. The war broke down into thousands of micro-battles, 10 men fighting over a single rocky outcrop, 20 men struggling to hold a frozen shack that offered a few degrees of warmth. The Russians utilized a ghost tactic. They would wait until the Austro-Hungarian units were exhausted from the climb, gasping for air and blinded by the glare of the snow. Only then would the Russian Siberian regiments, men who were accustomed to the brutal cold, emerge from the tree line. They didn't always fire. They used the bayonet and the butt of the rifle. In the thin mountain air, the sounds of combat carried for miles, the wet thud of steel on wool, the screams that were quickly swallowed by the wind. Austro-Hungarian Colonel Georg Wyth described the moral decay that set in during these ascents. He watched as his men, some of the finest in the empire, simply stopped moving. They would sit down in the snow, lean their heads against their packs, and surrender to the white sleep. It wasn't cowardice. It was the body's physiological reaction to the impossible demands of the command. The first ascent wasn't just a climb up a mountain. It was a climb out of the realm of human endurance. By the end of the first week, the wishful thinking of Chief of Staff Konrad von Hetzendorf collided with the immovable reality of the Russian defense. The Austro-Hungarian Third Army had gained perhaps 5 or 6 miles in some sectors, but at a cost that defied logic. The Ushak Pass remained firmly in Russian hands. The funnel was clogged with the dead. General Borovec telegraphed Vienna, pleading for the offensive to be halted. He reported that his regiments were at 30% strength not from combat but from natural attrition. The frostbite cases were so severe that doctors were performing dozens of amputations a day in field tents where the surgical instruments would freeze to the tables. But Konrad, sitting in his heated office in Teschen, refused to listen. To him, the map still showed possibilities. He ordered a second wave and then a third. He believed that if he poured enough human lives into the white grave, the sheer mass of the dead would eventually create a bridge to Przemysl. On the Western Front, you were surrounded by millions of men. In the Carpathians, you were alone with the cold and the heights. There are accounts of soldiers who claimed to hear voices in the wind, the call of the heights, luring them to walk off the edges of cliffs just to end the shivering. The first ascent proved that the Austro-Hungarian army was no longer a functional fighting force. It was a collection of suffering individuals being pushed to their deaths by a delusional leadership. The mountains had won the first round. The Russian bear was still perched on the peaks, looking down at the carnage below with cold, indifferent eyes. As the sun set on the failed January offensive, the focus of the war shifted. If the Austro-Hungarians couldn't break the Russian line in the south, the Germans would have to try a different, more terrifying approach in the north. The White Grave was about to expand its borders into the Masurian lakes, while the Austro-Hungarians were bleeding out in the vertical purgatory of the Carpathians. A different kind of nightmare was being engineered 500 miles to the north. In the jagged, lake-strewn landscape of East Prussia, the German High Command was preparing a masterclass in industrialized slaughter. If the Carpathian campaign was a story of incompetence and wishful thinking, the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, known to history as the Winter Battle in Masuria, was a story of terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency. For a premium audience, the horror here isn't just the death toll. It's the way the German commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, turned a natural disaster into a tactical weapon. They didn't just fight in a blizzard. They used the blizzard as a shroud to mask the movement of 250,000 men. By February 1915, the Russian 10th Army, commanded by General Thaddeus von Sievers, sat in a comfortable, if frozen, position along the eastern edge of the Masurian Lakes. They believed the winter had frozen the front into a stalemate. They assumed that no modern army could launch a major offensive in weather that could kill a man in an hour of exposure. They were wrong. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had spent weeks moving 4 new army corps into position. This was a logistical feat that defied the season. Using a dense network of East Prussian railways, the Germans funneled 250,000 men to the flanks of the Russian line. The plan was a double envelopment, a giant pincer designed to snap shut behind the Russian 10th Army and swallow it whole. On February 7, 1915, the hammer fell. But it didn't fall with a roar. It arrived in a blinding, suffocating whiteout. A massive snowstorm rolled across East Prussia, reducing visibility to a few meters. In any other war, this would have signaled a halt to operations. For the Germans, it was the signal to charge. Imagine the human tune of this advance. 250,000 men, weighed down by heavy wool coats that became sodden and frozen, pushing through snowdrifts that reached their waists. The Germans utilized snow battalions and specialized equipment. But for the average Landwehr soldier, it was a test of sheer mechanical will. They moved like ghosts through the white, their footsteps muffled by the powder, their breath freezing into masks of ice on their faces. The Russian 10th Army didn't even see them coming. Because of the storm, Russian aerial reconnaissance was grounded. Their cavalry scouts were blinded. Communication lines, already fragile, were snapped by the weight of the ice or severed by German saboteurs. General Sievers sat in his headquarters, unaware that 2 massive German armies were curling around his flanks like the arms of a starving predator. When the realization finally hit, it was too late. The German 10th Army struck from the north, and the German 8th Army struck from the south. The Russian flanks didn't just break, they evaporated. The war atelier element of this battle was the isolation. Because of the blizzard, Russian units were cut off into islands of resistance. A regiment would be fighting for its life in a frozen village, unaware that the unit half a mile away had already been annihilated. There was no front line, only a swirling, chaotic vortex of gray uniforms emerging from the white to fire a volley and vanish again. As the Russian 10th Army began a frantic, disorganized retreat toward the safety of the forest of Augustowo, the retreat itself turned into a death march. The roads were clogged with abandoned wagons, dead horses, and the discarded rifles of men who no longer cared about the Tsar. They only cared about the sensation of their toes turning black from frostbite. The climax of the Masurian maelstrom took place in the forest of Augustowo. For a week, the remnants of the Russian 20th Corps, about 40,000 men, was surrounded in these dense, primeval woods. This is where the human tune of the battle becomes a dirge. The forest was a labyrinth of frozen swamps and interlocking pines. The Russians had no food, no medicine, and almost no ammunition. They were hunted by German Jaegers who used the trees for cover, picking off anyone who tried to light a fire for warmth. To light a fire was to sign your death warrant. To not light one was to die of the cold. The accounts from the survivors of the 20th Corps are harrowing. They spoke of the Forest of Souls, where the trees were hung with the frozen bodies of men who had tried to climb them to see above the snow. They spoke of the sound of German artillery splintering the frozen wood, sending shards of timber through the air like shrapnel. By the time the 20th Corps finally surrendered on February 21st, they weren't an army anymore. They were a collection of walking corpses so traumatized by the white hell that many could no longer speak. The Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes was a catastrophe of staggering proportions. The Russian 10th Army had been effectively deleted from the order of battle. The Germans claimed to have taken 100,000 prisoners, along with 300 heavy guns and countless supplies. But for the German victors, the prestige was hollow. They had won a tactical masterpiece, yes, but they had also learned a terrifying truth. The Russian giant was deep. Even after losing an entire army, the Russian line simply fell back and solidified again. The winter battle had cost the Germans thousands of their own men to frostbite and exhaustion. They had pushed the Russians out of East Prussia, but they hadn't broken the back of the war. The war Atelier, legacy of Masuria, is found in the spring thaw. Months later, when the snow finally melted, the lakes and swamps of East Prussia gave up their secrets. Thousands of Russian soldiers who had been swallowed by the snowdrifts or drowned in the half-frozen lakes were revealed, their bodies perfectly preserved by the white grave local peasants spoke of. The forests of the dead where the spring flowers grew through the rib cages of the fallen. The Masurian maelstrom proved that in 1915, technology and nature had combined to create a form of warfare that was no longer recognizable to the human spirit. It was a war of statistics where 100,000 lives were the price of a few miles of frozen forest. As the German pincers relaxed and the survivors were marched into captivity, the eyes of the world turned back to the south. The divided giants were not finished. The fall of the 10th Army in the north was merely the prelude to the final, agonizing collapse of the south. The Siege of Shadows at Przemysl was reaching its breaking point, and the Forest of Souls was about to have a rival in the charnel house of Galicia. To the Russian 10th Army, the Forest of Augustowo was supposed to be a sanctuary. As the German pincer snapped shut during the winter battle in Masuria, these dense, primeval woods on the border of Poland and East Prussia were seen as the only place where the Russian 20th Corps could disappear. They hoped the thick canopy of pines and the labyrinthine frozen swamps would swallow them, shielding them from the relentless German artillery. Instead, the forest became an arboreal charnel house. It transformed from a place of refuge into a forest of souls, where the very trees seemed to participate in the slaughter. The forest of Augustowo in February 1915 was a world of white and black. The snow had drifted so high between the trunks that movement was nearly impossible. The Russian 20th Corps, roughly 40,000 men under General Pavel Bulgakov, found themselves squeezed into a pocket of woods that was shrinking every hour. The human tune here was one of total sensory deprivation. Imagine the sound, the constant rhythmic crack of frozen branches snapping under the weight of the ice, a sound that mimicked the report of a sniper's rifle. The air was so still and so cold that a whisper could carry for hundreds of yards, yet the fog and the falling snow made it impossible to see the enemy. The Russians were blind, but they were not alone. Surrounding them were the German 10th and 8th armies. The Germans didn't rush into the woods with bayonets. They were too efficient for that. Instead, they treated the forest like a massive hunting preserve. They positioned their machine guns at every clearing and path, and then they let their artillery do the talking. In the war Atelier aesthetic of war, the most terrifying weapon in Augustowo wasn't the bullet, it was the tree itself. German heavy artillery, positioned on the outskirts of the woods, fired shells with contact fuses designed to detonate in the treetops. When a shell hits the ground, the earth absorbs much of the blast. But when a shell explodes 50 feet up in a frozen canopy, it creates a vertical rain of death. The explosion would shatter the ancient pines, sending jagged, 2-foot-long shards of frozen wood screaming downward at the speed of sound. These wooden splinters acted like prehistoric shrapnel. Soldiers huddling at the base of trees for cover were not killed by steel, but by the forest itself. They were impaled, blinded, and crushed by the very shelter they sought. Survivors spoke of the screaming trees, the sound of the wood groaning before it splintered, followed by the silence of men who had been buried under tons of timber and ice. The forest floor was no longer earth. It was a carpet of needles, blood, and jagged wood. The German Jaegers, the hunters, moved through the outskirts of the forest with a terrifying, methodical patience. They knew the Russians were starving. General Bulgakov's men had been cut off from their supply trains for over a week. They were eating the bark off the trees and melting snow for water, but they had no way to cook. To light a fire in the Augustowo forest was to commit suicide. The smoke would rise through the black pines, a gray signal against the white sky, and within minutes a German battery would zero in on the heat. This created a choice that pushed the human mind to the breaking point: die of the cold in the absolute darkness, or light a fire and die in a barrage of high explosives. Primary source accounts from Russian survivors describe a state of waking death. Men were found wandering in circles, their minds shattered by the lack of sleep and the constant threat of the splintering trees. One account speaks of a Russian captain who found a group of his men sitting in a circle, staring at a pile of unlit wood. They were going through the motions of warming their hands over a fire that didn't exist, a collective hallucination born of extreme hypothermia and trauma. Despite the horror, the Russian 20th Corps did not simply surrender. They fought with a desperate, animalistic ferocity that surprised the German high command. General Bulgakov knew that every hour he held the forest was an hour the rest of the 10th Army had to escape the pincer. The fighting in the clearings was intimate and brutal. It was a war of the bayonet and the shovel. Because the snow was so deep, men would often stumble onto each other before they realized they were enemies. There are reports of Russian soldiers, out of ammunition, leaping from the trees onto German patrols, using their bare hands and teeth in a primal struggle for survival. But bravery cannot overcome the logistics of the grave. By February 21st, the 20th Corps was down to its last few thousand effectives. They were squeezed into a tiny sector near the center of the forest. The Germans brought up searchlights at night, bathing the woods in an eerie, artificial glare that made the frozen trees look like the bars of a cage. When General Bulgakov finally realized that his men could no longer hold their rifles, he ordered the surrender. But even the surrender was uncanny. As the German troops moved into the heart of the forest to collect their prisoners, they didn't find a defeated army. They found a graveyard of the living. Thousands of Russian soldiers emerged from the tree line, moving with the slow, stiff gait of the white sleep. Many were so frostbitten that their fingers snapped, like the frozen branches they had lived among. The German officers, usually so clinical and detached, were visibly shaken by the state of the men. They weren't soldiers. They were shadows that had been hollowed out by the forest. The butcher's bill for the Augustowo forest was staggering. While the rest of the 10th Army managed to fall back, the 20th Corps was annihilated. 12,000 men were dead, and over 28,000 were marched off into a captivity from which many would never return. For the premium viewer, the significance of Augustowo is not just tactical. It represents the moment the Eastern Front lost its human face and became something entirely more Gothic. The forest of Augustowo remained a site of horror long after the war moved on. Local folklore for decades spoke of the Forest of Souls, claiming that on cold February nights, you could still hear the splintering of the trees and the rhythmic gasping of the 20th Corps. The Germans had cleared East Prussia of the Russian threat, but at a cost to their own humanity. They had witnessed what happens when the natural world is turned into a weapon of mass destruction. They had seen the human tune silenced by the white grave. But while the forest grew silent, the mountains in the south were about to scream. The Siege of Shadows at Przemysl was reaching its final, bloody crescendo, and the cannibal hunger of the fortress was about to reveal a horror that made even the splintering trees of Augustowo seem merciful. By March 1915, The Austro-Hungarian fortress of Przemysl had ceased to be a military asset and had become a laboratory of human suffering. The Siege of Shadows had reached its endgame. For months, the garrison had been isolated in a landscape of gray stone and white ice. But as the final weeks approached, the psychological and physical degradation of the men took a turn toward the truly macabre. This was the era of Cannibal Hunger, a period where the basic tenets of civilization were bartered away for a mouthful of gristle. The most visible sign of the fortress's decay was the systematic disappearance of its animal life. It began with the thousands of horses that had once defined the prestige of the Habsburg cavalry. By March, over 10,000 horses had been slaughtered. In the early days of the siege, the meat was distributed according to military rank and regulation. By the end, there was no regulation, only the desperation of the human tune. When a horse died of exhaustion or was led to the slaughter, the soldiers didn't wait for a formal distribution. Men would swarm the carcass before the animal was even cold. There are reports of soldiers found in the subterranean galleries, hunched over raw slabs of horse meat, their faces smeared with dark, freezing blood. They had retreated into a primal state where the only reality was the caloric value of flesh. It wasn't just meat that had vanished. The bread being served to the 130,000 soldiers was a chemical insult. It was a mixture of a tiny amount of flour stretched with sawdust, ground straw, and even dried potato peels. This lacked any nutritional value, leading to a catastrophic outbreak of scurvy. The medical journals from the fortress described the Black Death of the trenches. Because of the total lack of vitamin C, the connective tissues of the men began to dissolve. Old scars from years-old wounds spontaneously reopened. Teeth fell out of blackened gums. Men's legs turned a deep, bruised purple as internal hemorrhaging began under the skin. Thousands of soldiers were rendered immobile, not by Russian bullets, but by the slow, agonizing disintegration of their own bodies. On March 19, 1915, Commander Hermann Kuzminich von Bergneustadt realized that the end was days away. Rather than wait for the final Russian surge, he ordered a desperate final breakout attempt. This was intended to be a sortie of honor, but it was a march of ghosts. The soldiers were ordered to carry their full kits and rifles. However, after months of starvation, many of the men couldn't even lift their packs. They moved out of the gates into the biting wind, stumbling over their own feet. The Russian 11th Army, watching from the heights, didn't even need to use heavy artillery. They simply opened fire with machine guns on the slow-moving, emaciated lines. Within hours, the sortie collapsed. Thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers simply sat down in the snow and refused to move again. They were done. Kuzminich knew that the fortress, with its massive heavy guns and millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, could not fall into Russian hands. On the night of March 21st and the early morning of March 22nd, the Siege of Shadows ended with a literal explosion. The garrison spent their final hours of freedom destroying their own home. They poured oil over their remaining supplies. They smashed their rifles against the stone walls. Most dramatically, they wired the great magazines and the massive steel turrets of the outer forts with explosives. The sound was said to be heard for 30 miles. The pride of the Austro-Hungarian engineering corps, the steel domes that were meant to protect the empire, were hurled into the air like toys. A thick, black cloud of soot and cordite settled over the city of Przemysl, mixing with the falling snow to create a black blizzard. When the Russian troops finally entered the ruins on March 22nd, the scene was one of profound human-tuned tragedy. They found a city of the walking dead. 117,000 soldiers and 2,500 officers surrendered. Among them were 9 generals who had tried to maintain their dignity in the face of total collapse. The Russians were horrified by what they found. The hospitals were filled with thousands of men who were too weak to even acknowledge their captors. The stench of the fortress, a mixture of rotting horse carcasses, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tongue of blood, was so overpowering that Russian units had to wear scarves over their faces just to process the prisoners. For the Tsar, the fall of Przemysl was an unexpected ray of sunshine in a dark winter. It was a massive propaganda victory. For the Central Powers, it was a humiliation. 130,000 men had been sacrificed for a prestige that had vanished in a cloud of smoke. The Cannibal Hunger of Przemysl proved that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was hollow. It showed that the divided giants in Vienna were willing to let their men descend into the lowest forms of animal existence, rather than admit a strategic error. As the survivors were marched toward the interior of Russia, many realized that the white grave of the fortress was merely being traded for the Siberian grave of the prison camps. The south was lost, the north was a stalemate. But as the spring thaw began to melt the snows of the Carpathians, the true butcher's bill of 1915 was about to be presented. The soldiers were reaching their breaking point, and the next chapter of the war would be defined not by siege or battle, but by the total collapse of the human spirit. By the spring of 1915, the human tune of the Eastern Front had shifted from a march of imperial duty to a low, discordant hum of resentment. The white grave had swallowed millions, and for the survivors, the psychological contract between the soldier and the state was beginning to disintegrate. This was the era of the breaking point, a period where the machinery of war didn't just stall, it began to turn against its creators. In the Austro-Hungarian ranks, the disaster of the Carpathian offensives and the fall of Przemysl had exposed a terrifying truth. The high command was incompetent. The common soldier, often a Czech, Slovak, or Pole with little personal stake in the survival of the Habsburg throne, began to realize that he was being spent like a cheap currency. The war Atelier reality was the loss of the veteran officer corps. In 1914, the professional officers had been the glue of the multi-ethnic empire. By 1915, they were gone, replaced by reserve officers who were often inexperienced and openly contemptuous of their Slavic troops. This wasn't just a military failure. It was a racial and social schism. The soldiers began to look at their commanders not as leaders, but as executioners. The most symbolic moment of this collapse occurred in April 1915 with the Czech 28th Regiment. This was a prestige unit from Prague, but its heart was no longer in the war. During the height of a Russian counterattack in the Carpathians, the entire regiment, nearly 2,000 men, simply stopped fighting. They didn't run away. They didn't rebel. They performed a passive surrender. As the Russian troops approached, the 28th Regiment stood up, laid down their rifles, and walked toward the Russian lines with their regimental band playing. To Vienna, this was high treason. To the men of the 28th, it was a rational response to an irrational war. They chose the uncertainty of a Russian prison camp over the certainty of a frozen death in a Habsburg trench. The reaction from the Austro-Hungarian High Command was a mixture of panic and fury. Emperor Franz Joseph ordered the regiment struck from the rolls of the army, its colors burned, and its history erased. But you cannot erase the human tune. The news of the 28th Tiet's surrender spread like a virus through the ranks, whispering a dangerous idea. You don't have to die for this. Desertion in 1915 wasn't always a dramatic flight across no man's land. Often, it was the silent desertion. Men would simply fail to return from patrols. Small groups would vanish into the mountain forests, living as green cadres or woods runners, preferring the life of a hunted animal to the life of a soldier. Primary source accounts from Russian interrogators at the time noted a change in the tone of the prisoners. They weren't broken by defeat. They were broken by betrayal. A captured Slovak soldier famously told his captors, "We are not surrendering to you. We are surrendering to the winter and to the fact that our generals have forgotten we are men." Across the lines, the Russian giant was also beginning to fray. While the unexpected ray of sunshine at Przemysl had boosted morale, the Great Retreat was looming. The Russian soldiers were beginning to suffer from the shell hunger, a catastrophic lack of artillery ammunition. Picture this: you Russian infantrymen in 1915. You reordered to hold a trench against a relentless German bombardment, but your own cannons are silent. Why? Because they've been rationed to just 3 shells a day. You're told to charge a machine gun nest, armed only with a bayonet because there aren't enough rifles to go around. A bitter revolutionary silence is falling over the Russian army. The seeds of the 1917 revolution weren't planted in grand halls, but in the frozen mud of 1915. What's truly haunting is the complete disconnect at the top. While entire regiments were simply vanishing, Generals like Konrad von Hitzendorf were still busy drawing up plans for grand new offensives. He didn't blame his flawed strategy or his broken supply lines for the failures. No, he blamed the racial inferiority of his own troops. This is the final, cruel folly. When a command structure begins to despise its own soldiers, the war is already lost. For the common man, this was the breaking point. The moment they realized their leaders were willing to burn the entire world down just to keep their thrones. As the spring thaw of 1915 finally arrived, the snow didn't bring rebirth. It revealed a butcher's bill of staggering proportions. Thousands upon thousands of bodies, preserved by the ice for months, began to emerge from the melting ground. The rivers ran gray with the debris of this vast white grave. The armies had survived the winter, but their humanity had not. The Eastern Front had become a theater of pure attrition, where victory meant nothing more than being the last man standing in a landscape of ruins. The scale of these winter battles is often overshadowed by the Western Front, but the numbers here are truly mind-boggling. In just 4 months of fighting in the Carpathians and Masurian lakes, the total casualty count exceeded 2 million men. To put that into perspective, that's an average of 16,000 men killed, wounded, or captured every single day. An entire division wiped off the map every 24 hours. Austro-Hungary alone lost 800,000 men in the Carpathians. The Russian Empire lost over 1 million, a catastrophic drain that would lead directly to the Great Retreat and eventually the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. This wasn't just a battle. It was the auditing of human loss. The moment 3 empires spent their entire future in the frozen forests of the East. Thank you for watching. Beyond the statistics, there was the human tune of the survivors. The men who returned from the Eastern Front in 1915 were not the same men who had marched out. They were the first generation of soldiers to experience nature as a combatant. They didn't just have PTSD from shellfire. They had a profound existential trauma born of the White Hell. They spoke of a world where the laws of physics and morality had suspended. They had seen comrades freeze solid while standing watch. They had eaten horse meat smeared with coal dust to keep it from spoiling. And they had been hunted through splintering forests by an enemy they could never see. This trauma didn't stay at the front. It traveled home in letters and in the hollow eyes of the wounded, poisoning the domestic spirit of Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. The prestige that the generals had fought for was dead. In its place was a growing, bitter realization that the leaders of Europe were playing a game with lives they did not value. The fall of Przemysl remained the most haunting symbol of the year. The fortress, once a monument to Habsburg power, was now a jagged ruin of twisted steel and scorched stone. But its legacy was more than rubble. The surrender of 117,000 men proved that the impregnable was a lie. It shattered the myth of Austro-Hungarian resilience and forced Germany to take total control of the Eastern Front effectively, turning the Habsburg Empire into a satellite state of Berlin. The war Atelier, legacy of the fortress, lived on in the prisoner of war columns. Tens of thousands of men were marched into the Russian interior toward Siberia. Many of these men would not return until 1920, and those who did brought back the seeds of revolution. The Siege of Shadows had ended, but the shadows were now spreading across the entire continent. The winter battles of 1915 were the cruel folly that made the later horrors of the war possible. Because the Austro-Hungarian army was so decimated, they were forced to beg for German help, leading to the Gorlice-Darno offensive. Because the Russian army had lost its best equipment and its veteran sergeants in the snow, they were unable to stop the German advance. The Butcher's Bill of 1915 was the down payment on the Russian Revolution. The soldiers who survived the White Grave were the same men who would eventually turn their rifles around and point them at their own officers. They had learned that the divided giants would let them freeze and starve for the sake of a map line, and they decided they would rather burn the map than die for it. Today, the battlefields of the 1915 winter are silent. The Carpathian passes are once again the domain of hikers and nature. But if you dig just a few inches below the surface of the Oshak Pass or the Augustowo forest, you still find the artifacts of the White Grave. You find rusted buttons with the Habsburg eagle, rotted leather from Russian boots, and the occasional splintered bone that the earth has refused to fully swallow. For the premium viewer, the lesson of 1915 is a chilling reminder of what happens when strategy is divorced from humanity. The winter battles were not won by tactical brilliance or heroic charges. They were won by whichever side could endure the most suffering before their spirit finally broke. It was a war of the abyss, where the only true victor was the cold, indifferent land itself. The Eastern Front of 1915 remains history's most brutal example of the cruel folly, a testament to the fact that when empires go to war with nature, it is always the soldier who pays the bill. A documentary of this scale requires months of archival research and atmospheric reconstruction. If you wish to see the Eastern Front and the other forgotten theaters of the Great War brought back to life in this detail, please support the channel by subscribing. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps this atelier running. What part of today's tragedy stayed with you the most? Leave a comment below. I read everyone.